So this paper is about how children and parents make decisions about the child's, make school decisions for the children in education systems characterized by some degree of stratification or tracking, curricular tracking, and such that basically when these choices are made at key stages during the education path, these choices carry consequences on the opportunity set, the choices and the outcomes that these children face and experience later on, for example, in college or on the labor market. And when thinking about how to think about this choice and how to analyze this choice, this paper basically has two main themes or focuses on two main dimensions of this choice. And the first one is kind of a building block for the second. So the first one is about the fact that given the age at which these choices are made, of the children, I mean, typically in schooling systems with curricular tracking sometime during adolescence, so typically between 14 and 16, though in some countries this happens earlier, and in some countries like the US, this happens basically just in college in a way. So these choices are characterized by a huge degree of uncertainty, in the sense that uncertainty about the child, because the child is young, and so maybe children and parents don't know that much about the child, what he likes and he doesn't like, and his human capital, if you like, his technology. And then uncertainty about the world, because it's like, the time horizon is pretty long, thinking about college and labor market and so on. And so these, by the way, are quotes from a sociological study in Italy, which is the country I focus on, which just gives you a sense of how, people feel about this choice. And the second theme is the idea that given the age, again, at which this choice is made during adolescence, and given the importance of this choice in terms of its consequences later on, it's not obvious who's the decision maker of this choice, or rather, what roles children and parents respectively play in making these decisions. And if many of you probably have children, maybe you can relate to some of these quotes, though maybe not about this specific decision domain. And so then this slide just restates these two main points or dimensions and draws kind of some links to the relevant literature. In some ways, this paper is related to the literature on the choice of major in college in the US, just because they are, especially the recent literature, is very explicit about the uncertainty that students face when choosing the major in college, and some of the work has been done by people in this room, for example, Matthew's paper with Bazit Zafar, and I think Joy is not here, but like the Arcidiacono Hodz and Kang paper. And then, on the other hand, this paper is related to this brand new literature on child-parent interactions. And I guess the papers we're going to see tomorrow in the child-parent games by Marco and Juan. However, I want to warn you immediately that, in a way, this work is complementary to that, in the sense that it doesn't take the view, the kind of principal-agent view in which child and parent interact strategically, but rather it takes the view that parents and children may have different roles in the choice, and whenever they make this choice multilaterally, it's more about sitting down, discussing these decisions, exchanging opinions, and try to pin down more in a cooperative fashion, like the final choice. So then the research questions in these papers can be summarized as follows. So the first point is about understanding what the main determinants of this choice are. And by main determinants, I mean presumably children and parents, when facing this choice with some uncertainty, they care about different outcomes or different consequences that choosing different alternatives may lead to. And so the question is about what are the main outcomes or the main consequences they care about when they make this choice. And it is also about distinguishing a little bit between whether it is about caring about certain outcomes versus others, or it is about the perceived likelihood that certain outcomes will occur given this, making one choice or the other. But I will be more precise in the next couple of slides, more formal, let's say, about what I mean by that. And then the second question is about, as I said, the relative roles that children and parents play in the choice, and it's going to boil down to an issue of the roles that beliefs and preferences of children and parents, how the different ingredients, how the different beliefs and preferences of children and parents drive the choices that we observe. And then the final question, concluding question is, do we care about distinguishing about these things or not? Not really. So of course, if we want to try and answer some of these questions, we confront an identification problem, which is somewhat a general one, which is the fact that there will be, in general, multiple configurations of beliefs, utility evaluations over outcomes, and decision rules that are compatible with the same distribution of choices that usually is what we observe. Usually we observe what choices people make or family makes, but we don't know much necessarily about these underlying mechanisms that lead to the choices. And so what can we do to make some progress? So, well, I guess make a number of assumptions first, and then perhaps try to collect some new data that will help on making some progress and learning about these mechanisms. So let me use a simple example to first tell you about the framework that I'm considering here, which is an extremely simple framework. So basically, it's going to tell you the main assumptions that I'm willing to maintain in this paper, and then conditional on those assumptions, the identification strategy that I'm going to use to learn something about those mechanisms, okay? So here is the example. I think it's also a useful example because ultimately the empirical application is just an extension to, more alternatives, more family rules, and more outcomes relative to this binary kind of example. So families are assumed to be dyadic, so there is one child and one parent in each family, and they face the track choice in high school. And let's assume here, for the sake of the example, that they face the choice between art and math, and that they only care about two things. They trade off, basically, whether the child will like the subjects or not. So it's like, does he like math and art or not, versus whether each training is going to give the child good opportunities, a good training later on to either continue to college or get some good job on the labor market. And then let's assume that there are only two possible decision rules, one in which the child chooses unilaterally, and one in which child and parent make a joint decision.
Is there some aspect where the parent is recognizing what the future preference of the child might be? You're talking just about a productivity consideration, but it could be that the parent would say, I'm making this choice in behalf of what I know my child would like to have done when that child is 25. I mean, I don't know if that's part of what you...
I'm going to show it to you, I guess, in the next slide or two. But basically here, the way parents behave in this kind of framework is that they share with the child, in a way, the objective function, like the expected utility, kind of, they have preferences over alternatives defined in terms of the same future outcomes or consequences of the choice, but they do it they look at the problem with their own lenses, meaning their own beliefs and utility parameters over those
that I understand. I'm just saying there could be another version of, I'm just thinking about the welfare of the child at a different age than now. So I'm just wondering if you have two different selves for the children. That's really my question.
Definitely. I totally agree with you, and this is not the case here.
Okay, fine.
But I totally agree, and there are many possible models we can think about.
Okay.
Yes.
Just clear.
So of course, so actually you might be disappointed now because I've been speaking a lot about uncertainty, but the way this model really works is, or this framework rather than a model really works, is that I treat uncertainty really as risk. In the sense that, of course, there is a question about whether the child will like the subjects or not in the different curricula, and whether the different trainings will give him or not good opportunities. And ex ante, there is some objective law or process that governs that. And so let's assume that these are the objective, these child-specific, track-specific realization probabilities for those outcomes under the different choice scenarios. But then I assume that child and parent have their own subjective guesses about what those probabilities are. And there is no really room for real uncertainty or ambiguity here, in the sense that I assume that they have their own subjective guesses about those probabilities, and they behave as if those guesses were correct somehow. So there is no room for, though there will be in another paper, and for different data that I've been collecting lately, but not in this paper and with this data. So in this case, people simply have their own guesses. And if there is unilateral decision making, then they use those beliefs and their own utility weights to make the choice within a subjective expected utility framework. If the choice is made jointly, then there is an aggregation problem. And in this, according to this specific rule, but there will be another one in the main application, it's a problem of aggregating the subjective expected utility of the decision participants, basically. Okay?
But I mean, I'm just trying to understand the decision problem. Is part of the decision problem the parent bribing the child to do something? In other words, giving payments conditional on performance or something.
I agree, and that's another paper actually, but...
no, I'm asking about this paper in particular. I mean,
no,
just clarifying,
I would consider that to be strategic interaction. So I'm telling you, here is about however we arrived in terms of beliefs and preferences at the moment of the decision, either one of the two chooses, or we sit together and we start making reasonings about what we know and the body of evidence, and we try to pin down one decision by aggregating our beliefs and our preferences in a cooperative kind of fashion. Yes?
It seems like the assumption you're making is one of linear utility, right? It's risk neutrality, not about the beliefs being correct in that whatever the beliefs are now, that's basic decision making, that's fine, whether we actually have rational.
So they may not be correct, but basically not being correct doesn't, and not being sure about the chances, doesn't affect their behavior.
That's because it's an assumption about the utility function.
Yes.
Right. But replacing sort of rational expectations with sort of beliefs we get from data, that's a separate issue, I think.
So, do you have any? I don't know. Do you have a question?
No, it's just a little black box. That's all. But that's okay.
Can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
Suppose that the parents are willing to sacrifice some utility in the future for the kids, to have some more income for him, more certainty about the future jobs, because they want him to be independent when they are not there anymore. Is this included in your framework?
I don't think so. No. And I also can show you, on that particular issue, one thing is the model or the framework, and one thing is actually what people think and the data, and I'm going to show you I'm going to tell you something later about that particular issues that seems like, for this particular choice and in the particular context I analyze here, parents don't, and children don't know and don't even worry, apparently, about that aspect, that is the future expected. We can believe it or not, but that is going to be the case.
But you observe the probabilities?
I observe the probabilities. Okay. I'm going to tell you in a couple of slides. Sorry? No, go on.
Because if you wouldn't observe, then...
No, I'm going to observe I'm going to elicit those. I'm going to collect those. So here is how okay, the framework is extremely simple, and here is how, more precisely, how the identification problem that I have in mind is defined. And this, in the sense that we can observe a certain family or distribution or a number of families making certain choices, and those choices can be compatible with different scenarios of beliefs, utility parameters, and decision rules. And in this particular example I came up with is one in which, in the very first row, it's a child who actually has correct beliefs, but ultimately only cares about, liking, enjoying the curriculum, and not about the future opportunities and choices in terms of college and labor market. The second example, instead, is one in which his preferences over outcomes are totally diffuse, but he actually has wrong beliefs about the opportunities that the different curricula will give him in terms of college and labor market. And the third example is one in which ultimately the choice that we observe is driven by the fact that there are two decision makers participating in the choice, and the one with actually wrong beliefs has more decision power than the other. And so then I can restate, in a way, the questions in terms of this specific framework. And my questions then will be, so the first question is about pinning down those utility parameters, and by utility parameters in the child utility function and in the parent's utility function. And then the second question instead is going to be about pinning down the decision weights. To say something about the relative roles that children and parents play in the choice. And then the third question is just a little thought exercise about basically what happens if we assume that by some policy, for example, we could change the children and parents' beliefs of a certain amount, and what's the effect of that on the distribution of choices now? And does it matter if we account for the fact that we are going to see there is some heterogeneity in decision rules across the families, as opposed to not accounting for that heterogeneity and assuming, for example, that there is a representative decision maker that or a unitary family, and we don't account for that heterogeneity. So here is the data. So I collected data in 9th grade, so in a sample of children who just started high school in September 2007 in a city in northern Italy. There was one questionnaire for the children. The children answered the questionnaire in school, in class. Virtually 100% participated of the targeted ones. And then also their parents, well, one of their parents took the questionnaire. They took it at home and then returned it to school. Participation rate was a bit lower, as expected. And then, okay, notice here the timing of this. So, of course, we interview these kids when they are in their first few days of high school. This means that we observe their choices, okay? So we observe what choices they made at the family level. And then we ask at that point, we ask their beliefs about future outcomes that presumably were important to inform their decisions, but haven't realized yet. And we ask about their individual preference. Actually, this is the data. And then we ask about their individual choice preferences. And the questions went a bit like this. So think back about a few months ago when you were still in 8th grade, and at the moment in which you made the final decisions, and think about what you thought was important to make the choice, so the main criteria that you thought were important to making these decisions. Now, look at this choice, look at this list of schools or type of schools. Please rank them from your most favorite one to your least favorite one according to your own preferences and criteria that you thought were important to making the decision. So the idea here is that we observe their actual choice, but we interpret the choice as the outcome of a family decision process. And then we try to elicit something about the ingredients entering that, the smaller components entering that process. And these components are their beliefs about future outcomes that we realize later on, but may be important in informing this decision. And then we elicit their individual preferences separately for children and parents over the choice set. And then at the end of the survey, after asking the other questions, we asked something about how the choice was made within the family. So whether who made the choice, whether the child made the choice unilaterally, whether the parents made it unilaterally, whether one made the choice after discussing with the other, or whether they made it together, basically. These were the categories. It turns out that these are the only 3 categories that are observed in the data. So neither the children nor the parents, or just very few of them, reported the parent making the choice, either unilaterally or after listening. So these are the 3 rules, what I call decision rule, family decision rules, I'm focusing on this paper.
Aren't you worried that the answer they give in your survey is affected by the discussion they had earlier on?
Yes, of course. That's kind of the main one among many, but one main criticism of this paper, which is due, I guess, to as you are pointing out, to the fact that everything is elicited retrospectively.
Yeah. So why didn't you do earlier?
That's what I'm doing now. In this case, what I did was, in terms of timing and budget, what I could do was one data collection. So having one data collection to do, I guess, what I thought was the best shot was, because I really wanted to have both the actual choices and the individual preferences.
So you know whether they discussed or not, right?
Sorry?
You know whether they discussed or on these issues.
That's based on the, it's a question in the survey, and I'm going to show you in the next slide like a table with putting together basically like their reports about their decision rule and comparing the actual choices that were observed and the stated preferences, okay? And then there was some question as well about what they know about each other's preferences.
Can I ask 2 questions?
Yes.
One is, how irreversible are these decisions? So you sort of decide on a particular track or decide, I mean, I don't know, in US schools, it's not a big decision. I'm wondering maybe in Italy, it's very strong.
Okay, so in
how much of incentive do they have to really invest in this decision is the first question.
Okay, so the Italian system is struck, but is considered to be flexible in the following sense, that even if you attend a vocational or a technical type curriculum, you can still later on choose to go to college. You can still enroll in college, differently from other countries like Germany, for example, where if you choose a vocational track, then you cannot.
But what's the transition rate? If you enter these lower
It's
tracks?
very low. It's very low.
So it's virtually certain that you're going to stay out of college if you
20%.
make this choice. So this is a big decision. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yes, that's
Okay,
it.
so
the transition rate is going to be about 90% or 95% even if you attended the general curriculum, meaning to college. If you attended the general curriculum, it's about between 90 and 95%. People go to college. If you attend the vocational curriculum, about 20% still go to college. But, yeah.
And then this last question, I'm just trying to clarify, just to cover D4. So when you say the child unilaterally, suppose that when the child is born, they show pictures of Bocconi University or whatever.
I totally agree.
So they grow up forever seeing they're going to college.
I totally agree.
Of course, by the time the kid's 14, he's internalized that. And
I totally agree. And I'm going to make clear that I'm not claiming that in this paper, I'm not looking at that part.
So this is like a social encounter at age 13 or something you're describing, more than the decision process.
This is a paper that says there are, I'm going to show it. Next slide. In this slide, but first I want to show you the data, if you allow me to. Okay. I think it's interesting because I don't think there are many data sets about this with this type of stuff, so I think it should be interesting. Okay, remember the decision rules. So I observed these 3 in the sense that I asked about also the other combinations, meaning the parent chooses unilaterally or the parent chooses after discussing with the child. Actually, the exact wording wasn't the child chose unilaterally. The exact wording was, I chose without any major discussion or exchange of opinions with my parents. Notice that this means that they could have talked with someone else. For example, they could have talked with their teachers, for example. So I'm not excluding that possibility. I'm just looking at the interaction between the child and the parent in terms of like discussion between child and parent. So this is the child chooses unilaterally. This is the child chooses after listening to the parent or after discussing, exchanging opinions. And this is child and parent make a joint decisions, the self-report of that. And this is how the percentage of families where the observed choice coincides or not with, with the individual stated preferences of the different members. So as you said, of course, correctly, like by the time of the final decisions, in half percent of the families, children and parents are aligned because of socialization. I totally agree about that. And this paper is not about this, because the only thing I could do is just retrospectively ask something about the moment of the final decision. I just concluded a new data collection now in which I follow them 4 points in times during the decision process. And I'm going to look at how beliefs and preferences and so on evolve during the year before the decision is made. Though even then, it might be late in the sense that, as you say, socialization starts at 0.
But I'm also thinking about just the transfers. I mean, I don't know how expensive it is to go to school and how much the parents play a role. So if there's conflict, can the parents punish the child in some sense, or by
public school?
Public school, no cost.
No cost here.
So
of course, later on to go to college.
Get out. Yeah.
Sorry?
No, I'm just trying to understand in what sense, if there's conflict, the parents. That goes back to the decision rule. You're not going to get into that here today.
No. In this new data collection I just mentioned, we and Marco is involved in that. We elicit also things about like allowances and transfer, conditional and unconditional effort behavior in school. But this is not. It's not this paper, okay? So I mean, it's important to be clear about that. So this paper is not about that. So by the time of the final decision, half of them are aligned in terms of choice preferences, and the other half are not. But what I think is interesting is that at least explicitly, of course, implicitly socialization, did its job. At least explicitly, children have, for the other half, had their own way much more often than parents did. So these sum up to 100, like by row, okay? There are 4 alternative categories, mutually exclusive categories here.
And this question is asked of the parents or the child?
Both.
Okay, so you get conflict.
What do you mean?
Well, I'm just
like
saying.
In the self-reports?
Yeah,
or
yeah.
In the self-reports, what happens is, of course, it's not perfect, meaning that there are contradictions, but I can tell you that there is very little contradiction in terms of classifying R1 relative to the others. There is much more noise between distinguishing between these two. So parents seem pretty much to agree with children about this category. There is much more noise in distinguishing between these two categories, meaning the child tends more to say, I chose after talking with my parents, and the parents tend more to say, we chose together. But they seem to agree pretty much about that. And actually, I have another piece of evidence about this, which is that if we disaggregate parents' participation rates in the survey, these parents participated heavily. Like over 80% of these parents participated. But these parents had a very low participation rate. And my reading of that is that these are kind of the hands-off, disengaged parents in the decision, or at least one possible interpretation of that.
So do you know anything about the children's peers, whether they're choosing the same way that their friends are?
So there is a question about the outcomes, the list of outcomes that I think might be important in the choice, and one asks about for each curriculum in the choice set, what's their subjective probability of being able to be in school with friends if they chose each curriculum. So it's a very reduced form way of capturing that, but there is a little bit of that captured by that kind of that question. Yes. Though in this new data collection I mentioned, I had a different design, like an adult type of design in which I elicit the network of friends. And so I know basically what each, the preferences of the friends. But this is, again, not this paper again. So I also asked something about, so I asked them basically to report what they think are the preferences of the other person within the family. And it turns out parents know much more their children's preferences, choice preference, than vice versa. But apart from that, they are in line with this idea that these families know much more about each other. This family don't know much about each other's preferences. So in that sense, is also, I'm sure there might be quite a bit of noise in this data, but I think they go in the right direction that we expect. So there is some information in these questions, I think. So just to clarify the point that was correctly made 5 minutes ago, this is the way I look at it. So there is certainly a long time before the final decision in which, children and parents both implicitly, because of socialization, and explicitly even, may kind of develop a common decision framework and even have time to converge in terms of what they know, what they believe, and what they like, they prefer. And I'm not going into that in this paper. But then we saw that at least about 50% of the families, even at the moment of the decision, there is some disagreement in terms of preferences. And that's the part I'm actually looking at in this paper. And so basically in this second stage in which they arrive at the last moment and they confront the decision and they somehow need to reconcile their preferences and their beliefs. So that's the part I'm focusing on in this paper. And this is like the formalization of that. So it's a fully Bayesian kind of framework in which if the child chooses unilaterally, he maximizes his subjective expected utility. If he chooses after discussing or exchanging opinions with his parents, what he does is he really chooses according to his preference parameters, but somehow he incorporates parental opinions into its own opinions. And this is like one recent, so some recent discussion in the Bayesian literature says that linear pooling might be a good way to, in fact, capture not aggregation of information. So it's likely that at this point, when they make the final decision, children and parents know the same things. They observe the same body of evidence, and they need to decide based on that. And so what they're really aggregating is not like different pieces of information or different views, but rather different ways of interpreting that body of evidence. And then the third rule is the case in which they choose jointly, and there is a recent paper in the Bayesian literature in which they derive this theorem about efficient.
So where do the omega-1 weights come from? I mean, I understand the formula.
I agree.
No, I'm just asking.
It's silent, this paper, about that, in the sense that okay. I provide an estimate of them, but where they come from.
Paula? Wouldn't you imagine that do you have the education of the parents? Do those weights are related to education? Maybe a kid may trust more a PhD parent rather than a high school dropout parent to tell him about
what I observe, I'm going to observe in terms of the empirical results is that definitely those weights are going to vary across outcomes. So the weights that children give to their parents' opinions are going to be different depending on, they weight their parents more for certain outcomes than for others. But then, of course, I could allow for some heterogeneity and see what they depend on.
So is this a way of trying to capture the fact that the parents are giving inputs to the child and that's changing their beliefs?
I think that's a tricky question because
it's not clear what beliefs are being changed. It's not over the attributes of the choice in each of the states, right?
Saying that their beliefs are changed is like saying that there is really transmission. That if that sticks, then that would be a way to. So that would be one view of saying, through making this choice in this way, not only I affect the choice per se, but I also leave my children with something that they're going to carry later on, and then affecting even later choices, like changing their beliefs.
But just could you go back to this unilateral decision? I want to make sure I understand it.
Sorry?
No, just the first problem, R1, the unilateral case.
Okay.
So the weights, so what's this decision that the child's making? I understand it's a weighted average, but why the uncertainty? I guess the question is, you could imagine uncertainty over the attributes of being in college or not.
Correct.
These two choices.
That's it. So the idea is like, for example, take the following outcome. So if I choose curriculum, so Michelangelo, which was art, with some probability I'm going to like it, with some probability I'm not going to like it. Okay, so the utility weight is the difference in utility between the state of the world in which I'm going to like it versus the state of the world in which I'm not going to like it. And versus another attribute, which could be, I'm going to find a great job afterwards if I attend this curriculum and graduate from this curriculum. Then either there is a state of the world in which I'm going to find a great job that I like versus a state of the world in which I want. And then the delta U is like the difference in utility between these two states of the world conditional on that choice. So it's like really the consequences, the possible consequences of these choices. That's what it is.
The delta U's and the P's seem to be the same across these three decisioning things.
So the P's are going to be different, so are totally arbitrary and heterogeneous, and the delta U's this is a kind of standard random, it's going to be standard random utility model type of framework in which basically they are going to be the same, I mean, they don't need to, but they're going to be the same across alternatives. So
the child's report about whether they are making this decision unilaterally also depends on their sense of locus of control, right? Do they feel like they control decisions in general? And that's correlated with things like, what do I think about how I'm going to be in university?
I agree. So you're saying that selection into different decision rules is going to be related with other things about the decision, like yes, I agree with that. So I'm not modeling selection into different rules, but I totally agree I'm taking those as given, but I agree that should be kind of next focus of this. And actually, the original plan of this paper was to model that, because I thought that, in fact, was the most interesting part of it. But in a way, part of the reason why I'm also not looking into that is that this problem of I have these huge non-participation rates for the R1 parents. And so I don't have really much information about them. So basically, the parents of the children who say that they chose by themselves, they didn't respond in a great, many of them did not participate in the survey, and so I don't have information about them. I don't know what their beliefs were.
So what is being estimated there? What
yes. So this is what is being estimated. So
are there going to be, another way of thinking of that question is, are there going to be cross-regime restrictions? Structure?
No.
Okay, so. No. So this kind of...
I'm allowing different utility weights.
Different everything?
Everything for each, yes.
Okay,
correct.
so
there are no...
So the selection thing is kind of built into the parameters, yeah.
Yes.
It's not, you're not kind of using
correct.
it for it.
No, totally correct, yes. So this is how this is estimated and identified in the unilateral decision rule. So I can use only reveal preference or stated preference data, or can use them together. And basically, heterogeneity in beliefs across children or across families are going to pin down this. So this is really standard. It's just, just discrete choice model, like super standard, like nothing fancy. And this is the other case in which I observe multilateral decision making. And so here I really need the stated and revealed preference data, because what the stated preference data is going to buy me are the utility parameters in the individual, in the different members' utility functions, and then together with the variation in beliefs across families. But then the variation that I observe within the family in terms of stated preferences of the individual member versus the actual choice that I observe, that variation is going to buy me the decision weights, to the extent that variation exists, because we saw that for 50% of the families, they are totally aligned, and their preferences are, in fact, coincide with the actual choices. So this is how. So this is like kind of borrowing some framework from the transportation and marketing literature on stated and stated and revealed preferences and combine them to learn something about multilateral decision making in discrete choice frameworks. So this is kind of the idea. How much time do I have? Like a couple minutes? 5? Everything is really standard, as I said, in terms of estimation. I have an issue with sampling because it's choice-based sampling, but not difficult to deal with. And so in terms of results, I guess. So it turns out that the most important outcomes is whether the child likes the thing or not. And this is true both in the child's utility and in the parent's utility. And they worry much less about the other outcomes. For example, future opportunities and choices, though there is variation in those parameters once we allow for different regimes. And as he said, of course, since there is no cross-restriction, it turns out that actually those utility parameters are going to be different among different groups. And maybe more interesting is what I find for the weights. And so I find that in the R2 case, that is when the child chooses after listening to the parents or after discussing with the parents, children gives different weights to the parents' beliefs depending on the outcome we're talking about. And I can reject a model in which there is only one weight that aggregates all the same weight for all the outcomes. Whereas the opposite is true for the R3 case in which there is basically just one weight aggregating expected utility. So if I allow for a weight that is outcome specific, I reject that specification, and the weights are like this. So there is a predominant influence of the parent when child and parent make a joint decision. Then I do some specification tests and see whether the data supports these specifications. And so it turns out, as I was saying before, based on the raw data, that the distinction between the case in which children chooses unilaterally and the other two cases seems supported, like it's clear the difference, but it's much harder to, in fact, distinguish between these two cases. Probably data is just much more noise. I mean, like there's less information. It's a much finer distinction between this behavior and this behavior, probably, for the data to really be able to distinguish. And I'm going to skip the counterfactuals, though I find that basically accounting for the heterogeneity in decision rules, I get the same qualitative predictions in terms of reactions, in terms of response reactions to changes in beliefs, but quantitatively different. And so, so basically the recommendation is that, yes, we should be worrying about adolescent decision making, and also, like, as I mentioned, I have this new data collection where I worry about many more things than this paper and the ones that you correctly, many of the ones you correctly pointed out in your comments. And
can you say what kind of environmental factors? I guess you said you didn't do that, but I guess the point is what environmental factors lead to different decision processes.
That's exactly. I think that's the most interesting question.
And in some sense, how does that actually causally affect living standards? But we don't have we can't say anything about it.
Not with this paper, but I think that's an interesting question. Actually, I must say it was probably the initial idea for this project, and then didn't really work out very well. But the hope is that we, thinking more about these things, and with the new data collections, we can say something more about that, yes.
So you're going to collect in this later data regrets and so forth.
We collect, so the difference of this new data collection, which is an important difference, is that, first of all, it's prospective and is longitudinal. So the idea is, through the school. Later on, maybe that will be the next. Resources are scarce, and both in terms of human capital and in terms of money. So I'm building up. I'm enlarging. At each iteration, I'm enlarging the sample and enlarging the research team. So hopefully at some point we'll get there.
Last question.
Is there any way pushing more sort of what can we learn from here to try to understand those omegas a little bit, how they combine the information, and from a policy or welfare perspective, try to make the decision making more optimal in the sense of having policies that force these families to assign more weight to the people who know best, who have more sort of objective or subjective beliefs that are consistent with what objectively is going to happen to these kids, because that's from a welfare perspective, that's what we want, right?
I totally
these families
agree.
to be making the right decisions. So
I totally agree. I guess one problem with that is a bit like what we were discussing before, that by the time, in terms of this specific paper, by the time the choice is made, probably what children and parents know. It's basically, so I guess my interpretation of these weights is really not that they are aggregating different information, but they are interpreting information differently, possibly. But I agree that would be kind of, and of course there are some of these outcomes are more objective. So some of the counterfactual I do, which is really with the limitations of those counterfactuals, because of course I don't have a model of beliefs revision given some information that I give to them. But some of these are about more objective of the type I think you are suggesting. Like, what if we told them, for example, about the outcomes of previous cohorts? And so, for example, actual graduation rates, and actual rates of enrollment in college and so on. How would they use that information? Like, would their beliefs be different if they knew those things and so on? So those are kind of the exercise I do at the end of the paper. But the problem is that, there is no model here about expectation.